Hi guys, I'm Karen Rice. Welcome to my watercolour channel. I'm going to be painting a bird's nest, experimenting with different techniques. 5 techniques in fact: Brusho, watercolour pencils, spattering, sponging and stippling, which is more of a traditional watercolour technique. So shall we get started? Here is the finished painting, and each egg has got a different technique. I thought it was a really useful way of practicing the techniques by painting this bird's nest. So it's a fun thing to do. So I really hope you're going to enjoy it. Here are most of the materials I'll be using. As I say, a full list of these can be found in the description below. I'm using 300 grams cold pressed paper. I'm using a wax crayon here, and I'm just rubbing gently onto the surface of the paper. I've actually drawn my eggs and nest with a watercolour pencil, a black watercolour pencil, so that will dissolve a little as I use the paint and water. I'm using Quinacridone Gold to paint the base colour of the nest, wet on dry with my size 10 brush. I'm using a SCHMINCKE watercolour box there. It's got some lovely delicious colours, and I'll put a list of the colours in the description below with alternatives. Giving a good spatter as well, using a little bit of green and red mixed together, damp into damp, to create some sort of different colours in the nest. I'm working my way around now very carefully, sort of damp into damp or wet into wet if your paper is still wet at this stage, painting around the edge of the eggs. And as you can see, the centre is a lot darker than the outside edge. This is the negative space in the centre of the eggs here as well. I love these triangle negative shapes, they're really effective. I'm wetting each egg now, this first stage, to try out these different techniques. The first technique is Brusho. Come in these little drums. I punched a little hole in the top there, and I'm just going to tap it to release the Brusho. I will have a link in the description below where I have created a tutorial all about Brusho, so if you are interested in it, check out the description below. So I am using my brush now just to sort of loosen up and wet some of the Brusho there, and it creates these lovely marvellous effects. They're little tiny sort of firework explosions of colours. They all separate and create some gorgeous textures, marks that give that impression on the bird's eggs, as you can see in the photograph. So I'm just using my brush now just to manipulate this Brusho. And what I'm doing now is I've wet this next egg, and I'm actually just using traditional techniques here, wetting or damp into wet or damp into damp mark making using very creamy dark paint. And I've mixed up green and red to create this dark, but you could use Payne's grey, you can even use black and red, black and green. You can really experiment with your darks, but you can just using my size 4 brush, working damp into damp, so it's very effective. This is a very, very thin wash of Quinacridone Gold, and I'm using a watercolour pencil, it's Sepia, and I'm just drawing into the wet surface, creating all these different marks that you can see on the eggs here. And it's really effective. You get this sort of smudgy mark, almost like using a felt tip. The watercolour pencil, when you draw on a wet surface, it creates these effects. But I'm also going to use an emery board. As you can see here, you could use sandpaper, and you rub the tip of the pencil against the emery board or sandpaper, and it releases more pigment onto the wet surface, and it dissolves and creates some lovely textures there. I'm using a natural sponge now with some Payne's grey, and I'm just painting it onto the damp sponge and then stippling or pressing very gently onto damp paper here for my 4th egg. And for my final egg, I'm wetting the surface again. I'm using my size 14 brush. I'm not going to paint straight away. I'm just going to paint a little bit in the background because I want that wet surface there on that last egg to dry off a little bit, because I'm going to spatter, and if I spattered too soon it would all just dissolve and it would actually just be one colour, and I want the marks to stay put. So I'm going to spatter damp into damp. So I'm just painting some lovely Cerulean and yellow and Quinacridone Gold into the background there, using lots of brush marks and mixing up some darker greens now as well, working damp into damp. So I've used a bit of my imagination in the background because it doesn't exist in the photograph. I wanted to put this nest in more of a natural setting. And now I'm spattering this damp egg with very creamy paint, so it's damp into damp. And do you know what, I really like this technique. It's really effective, and you get these wonderful random marks that sort of create that look, that pattern of those speckled eggs. I've actually produced a longer tutorial of this demonstration here, and it's available on my Patreon membership. If you are interested in a little bit more discussion about colour mixing, and I just take you through a much more step-by-step process, check that out in the description below. And if you'd like to join, you can cancel anytime. But I'm throwing everything at this painting. I've got more Brusho, I'm using my twig, I've spritzed, I've got salt, just to create some lovely textures in the background. So I've allowed my painting to dry, and I've actually also used some rubbing alcohol in the background as well. I'm now using a wax candle again and rubbing into the dry surface. And I'm going to paint wet on dry with my size 10 brush, the background, the dark area in the center of the nest, carefully around those eggs, building up those darks with a mixture. You could use Payne's grey on its own. I've used a mixture of green and red. When I started out this tutorial, I was only going to show you sort of 5 different techniques with the eggs, and it turned into this painting, so I thought I'd share it with you. So I'm just building up some of the darks now around the outside of the nest here, just building up those details and a little bit more mark making inside the nest as well. And I'm used my plastic card to scrape off. I did it earlier as well. I'm just creating some lovely light textured marks. I've allowed my painting to dry. I'm just reactivating some of the Brusho here with my size 4 brush with just some clean water. And for my little egg where I spattered damp into damp, I'm now spattering wet on dry. So it's quite effective. I'm using the watercolour pencil now on the dry surface as well, just to get some sort of slightly different effects. And I'm going to use my wet damp brush as well, just to activate the pigment here, just to create some darker marks. So you get some really interesting effects using these different techniques. And you might decide that you prefer one over the other, or a couple. I'm using the sponge now, wet on dry, to create some darker marks. That's so effective there. I'm using my size 4 brush with a mixture of the ultramarine with some of the darks that I created earlier. It's very dilute, and I'm softening now with my size 10 brush, just building up the shadows on the eggs and around the eggs. As you saw there, I put a little bit more dark in the background, some more spattering on the eggs and in the background, and just building up some warmer mid-tones on the nest. Using my size 10 brush now, painting some dark brown colour just on the left hand side with a bit more shadow here to create some depth. I'm just giving my eggs another little spatter to create more light really, as well as details and textures. And I'm actually using a plastic card to print some of this white gouache onto the surface of the nest just to create some more light and textures. I really hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. This is the finished painting. I've used these 5 main techniques on those eggs and I really am pleased with it. I really hope you found this tutorial helpful and inspirational, that it encourages you maybe to get your watercolours out and try these techniques out and maybe even attempt this little tutorial. Thank you so much for watching, and if you'd like to see more tutorials like this, don't forget, if you haven't already, to subscribe to my YouTube channel, and for those longer tutorials, maybe check out my Patreon membership. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments section below. Thank you again for watching. Happy painting. Bye for now.